Good morning, Breanne here. I am standing in my studio and I wanted to give you a little behind the scenes tour of what it is that I'm working on right now in this moment. And also just to briefly mention this idea that we are often so disconnected from so much in our lives. An example would be the food that we eat. We might get in the car and just go to the store and decide that we want to pick any number of things off the shelf and not really think too much of it. The same thing goes for our clothing that we wear. There is so much that is involved in producing just one piece of clothing, and I wanted to give you some little bit of an insight and a sneak peek behind the scenes of the life of a designer as to the process. So this process goes from obviously idea to creating the pattern to checking the pattern and then making that piece of clothing. And of course, there's hundreds of different steps in between that process, but you get the idea. And today I am checking different pieces. So you can see on the floor, other than the fabric, there's a whole bunch of pattern pieces. So right here is the willow cocoon pattern. Here we have the juniper dress pattern in sizes 0x all the way to 3x. And of course, what's happening on the table right here as well. And so there's two technical terms. One is called marking and grading. I won't get too specific, but basically when you grade a pattern, you are essentially sizing that pattern up or down according to specific measurements. So if you're going to size up an armhole, 1 point in the armhole, maybe 1/8 of an inch, and then at the hem, 1/2 of an inch, to be able to make sure that those numbers match up. And so right now what I'm doing is checking some of my patterns because I have a feeling that some of them were not digitized correctly or entered into the computer correctly. And when patterns are entered incorrectly, you can have all sorts of problems in production when you actually, make that garment. And I want to try to avoid those problems. And so what is involved is having to do the work and check the pattern pieces just to make sure. And so I'll give you an example here. This is the willow cocoon pattern. And what I'm trying to do here is match up this pocket piece over here. And you can tell that it's not quite fitting right. And I do think that this pattern was not entered into the computer correctly, unfortunately. The other pattern pieces I am checking is this pocket right here to make sure that that lines up. And then it goes around like this. And then there's an edging that goes along. And so basically what you want to do is match up these little notches that you can see right here. And if these notches don't match, usually that's a sign that there is something wrong with the pattern, because when you go to actually manufacture that pattern, you want to make sure that the people who are sewing it know exactly where to stop a seam, where to reinforce a seam. And so everything has to be perfect, exactly. So right now, this pattern right here that you can see, this is an example of the willow cocoon. And that is the pattern that I am checking to make sure that it was sized correctly up and down. And that's a very brief little insight into the life of a designer and how clothing gets made. And stay tuned for the next video. I hope you learned something new. Thank you.